Good evening, this is Connor Kreider with a special report. Earlier in the week, I sat down with Bruce Brown to talk about the counterculture and other major events in the 1960s, including the space race, the Civil Rights Act, and the nuclear arms stockpile. We now bring you to the interview. A teenager in Newport during the 1960s, Bruce Brown lived what we are taught in our history books. Now 64 and retired in Newport, I was able to visit his house for an interview on what it was like to live in the 60s. So in the 1960s, it was known for its counterculture, like sex, drugs, rock and roll, and that was big in the anti-war movement. How was that in Newport, Maine, where you grew up?
Well, in Newport, we were still a little bit naive, and we heard a lot more about that than actually took part in it. I know it'd be much more exciting if I could tell you that we were doing all the things that they talk about on the street channel.
So there were no riots around here, or no protests.
Those were all done in big cities.
In bigger cities.
You know, there were small protests in Bangor and Portland. Nothing life-threatening or anything like that.
So a lot of like pro-war movements, anti-war movements.
Well, I can tell you this. A lot of people didn't want to go to Vietnam.
So with all the protests going on, police sometimes would have to use violence. Up here, did they agree with that around this area, or were they against the use of violence, or were they against the protest happening because they felt that it was people's rights to go and serve over in the military?
Well, I think at first it was definitely, police definitely did not want to see anything take place. But it grew out of proportion, and so like I said, in the state of Maine, it never got too bad. Bangor and Portland, a little bit, and sometimes at the colleges, you know. But as a police state in the state of Maine, there was nothing really conscious that you saw. It's just very much like it is right now. Sometimes you hear of riots in big cities and minor ones in colleges, but nothing real serious.
But there's nothing on that large of a scale around rural Maine.
No, you know, we're and I proudly say this, we're a little bit naive. We don't know exactly a lot of the things that take place in this world that filled with evil. We hear about it, we know about it, but we don't experience it to the degree other people do.
So there was a lot of, I don't know if you would know this exactly, but like excess drug use around like major cities down there. Was that the same effect up here?
Most certain. That was a problem, definitely. When freshmen came into college, it wasn't unusual to see half or 3/4 of the class by Christmas fail. And that sounds like I'm exaggerating. So in other words, they wouldn't be in college by Christmas. Because if they got experimenting with all the stuff that you heard about, and many people did, they just didn't last. It took their minds away from the studies. They didn't show up for class. I had a very good friend that I know he got into pot, and then, not saying that pot led to other things, but it did lead him to other things. And he ended up at the Mental Health Institute in Bangor, and so there was LSD and that type of stuff that's really mind-altering thing. Not were they only mind-altering, they were life-altering because they ruined a lot of people's lives, no question about that.
So there was no fear with you at that school of having to go into the draft. What about some of your friends in this area?
Well, what happened when I was at an age where we had a lottery. Now what happened was, this is going to seem like ancient history, but they had a fishbowl on television, and they had every date of the year in that bowl. And when they picked out that date, like it was number 1, let's say your birthday was April 1st, you were going to be drafted. Then the second one that came out, so the furthest away from number 1 you were was when you were going to be drafted. I remember mine being 153. So I was a sophomore in college, so I was hoping that I would be able to finish college before I was drafted. So when I became a senior and graduated is when the Vietnam War came to a stop. So I wasn't drafted, I didn't go. So people my exact age, a lot of them, just the way their ages fell, didn't go into the military.
The Civil Rights Act was also developing during the 1960s. Was that as big up in the north part of the U.S. as it was the South, or was that not as much of an issue?
Well, we heard a lot about it. We didn't see it much. But we heard a lot about it. Martin Luther King was very prominent. And I don't think we understood, especially the youth, understood the importance of what he was trying to do. We really thought, because of our lack of seeing this firsthand, I think we thought Martin Luther King at one time was a troublemaker, in a sense. And I hate to say that because I know a lot of people would revolt against me saying that. But I think that's how we looked at it because we didn't know. And of course, he was always trying to lead in peace and love and all that kind of thing. And a very sincere person of trying to, I hope it's okay if I have my kitty.
Yes.
Hi. When he was killed, I remember the night he was killed. I had a band and we were rehearsing that night. And when I heard it, I felt stunned, but it wasn't the same feeling as when President Kennedy was shot. But it was a tough thing because we said, how many people are going to be killed before this whole thing is over with? It seemed like every time you turned around, a prominent figure was gone.
During the Civil Rights Movement, there was a lot of violence from black power groups and black nationalism groups. Do you think that helped their cause or hurt their cause more?
Well, anytime you have violence, it never helps anything. It never helps anything because you create a violent act and then it's automatically comes with another counter-violent attack. So violence never solves anything. If you want a war and the one who survives with the most numbers left wins, but I think the only way that it was awful to I've never been able to understand how, because I didn't live in the South, I couldn't understand how I would ask another human being not to be in that bathroom because they were a different color than myself.
So with all the assassinations going on during the 1960s with President Kennedy, Kennedy's brother, Martin Luther King, did it kind of give you a sense that the U.S. is going into chaos?
Well, it's hard to believe when I explain this. When I was in 7th grade, 8th grade, we had in Newport, we had alarms in case of a nuclear attack.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so as 7th graders, we were really thinking we might not be here the next day. It was really, I can't explain it, but I don't think any 12-year-old should have to experience that. But we would get under our desk. And of course, a nuclear attack, getting on your desk wouldn't do anything other than maybe lead to your death even quicker. But, we were all naive, but we also were aware that the world might come to an end. And we were thinking it was very possible. And the Russians had missiles in Cuba, just a little ways away from us. And President Kennedy's administration said, you have to get these out of here by that date. And they hadn't. They only did it hours before the set time. And we just didn't know what the world was going to be like. We didn't know if we were going to nuclear war. That was Khrushchev, who was the leader of Russia at that time. In his address to the United Nations, I mean, the guy was definitely crazy. I mean, took off his shoe and pounded on his desk, telling that the death of the United States was going to be in the near future. And so, being 12 years old, I said, what in the heck is going on? So, it was very scary, very unsure of ourselves.
Do you think the U.S. should have gotten into the nuclear arms race with Russia and trying to build up their nuclear arms, I don't know, like the armory?
Yeah.
Or stockpile, I guess you could say?
Yeah.
Do you agree that they should have done that just to prove like who was the greater superpower in the world, or do you think they just should have let bygones be bygones?
Well, Carl Sagan, who's a noted scientist, has this thing called the blue dot, and he shows the pictures of the universe. Have you seen that?
No.
Pictures of the universe. And he shows in our universe, because they found out there's many other universes besides ours. But is it universe? Am I using the correct term? I'm not sure I am. But anyways, they show the Earth as a little dot compared to everything around us. We're just a little dot. And that's the name of Carl Sagan's piece, is the blue dot. So I think we all take ourselves a little bit too seriously. When we do that, we get ourselves into trouble. Everybody wants to be the ruler of the world. Everybody wants to be the leader of the country. Everybody wants to be the mayor of the city. So there's people who are always seeking power, and they want to direct things the way they want to see them. And that's one of the things about mankind that's just doesn't work very well, because it leads to wars. It leads to if we really did things right, we would never fight with another country. But because we're human, it happens. And with the terrorist movements, that doesn't even, they don't even take any pains to let them know that you guys are enemies. They come, when they hit the New York City in 2001, we were shocked that anybody would do that without us. We're coming after you. There was none of that. So, anyways, it's the lack of knowledge and our human instincts that lead to terrible situations.
Sorry to keep interrupting.
No, you're fine.
There was fear too. I think we fear each other. So they stockpile because we're afraid, they're afraid. Just all, it's like you say, it's fear of trusting each other, that you're not going to be behind somebody because they're going to blow us up before we can blow them up.
I think a lot of it has a lot of individuals have this
Craving for power.
craving.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. I can't relate to it because I've never wanted power. I just wanted to be a part of having a positive experience with a lot of different people, and so I don't understand it, and but I know that there are those people that want, and I think it's probably good that there are people that want power, because that's how we do move forward sometimes, but not through wars. Not through wars. No.
So with the nuclear arms buildup, was there always that constant fear that the Russians were going to attack us and then we were going to attack the Russians right after, or vice versa?
That was exactly the fear. It was just between the Russians and the United States at that time. We knew China had some things going on. It was a very big place, but China was overloaded with administrators rather than a large part of their population were just trying to survive is what it was. So they weren't a big power at that time. But I think in many ways, financially, China has kind of taken over the world at this time. That's scary right there. So I don't know how they are nuclear stocked. I don't know how Russia's nuclear stocked. I know that we're very well stocked. It was on 60 Minutes the other day that a lot of our nuclear land targets and where they'll be launched from, if they ever were launched, are run by technology 40, 50 years old. So that's kind of scary that we're using. But they said if we were using modern technology, that other countries might be able to intercept some of our things and prevent us from doing what we needed to do, whatever that is. So, anyway.
Also along the same time, it was the space race with the Soviet Union and the U.S. What were people's thoughts about that when all of this was occurring?
Well, it was a great way to release some pressure, because even though it appeared like the Russians were ahead of us a lot of times in the space race, we actually got to the moon, and I'm sure every person who was aware of life at that time remembers where they were. You know, like I say, everybody remembers where they were when President Kennedy was shot. Everybody remembers where they were when on the moon. And a lot, of course, the Russians and other people, European countries, Asian countries looked at, and a lot of people accused us of staging that. That was on a Hollywood stage, not the moon itself. And of course, the citizens of the United States, we were laughing because we thought it was partly due to jealousy of what we had accomplished in such a short time. And it was amazing. We couldn't believe that somebody was actually on the moon.
So, was the space race a distraction from what was going on overseas in Vietnam, or was...
It was a good distraction. It was good that we had that, yes, because at least it didn't include death unless something terrible happened, and so when we actually saw these astronauts on the moon, I mean, it was a sigh of relief, but it was a lot of fun as well, and we knew that history was being made, and nothing like that would probably ever occur again, as far as being so amazing.
So, in the 60s, it was known for its music changing with the culture. What major events in that era impacted the music that we have today?
Definitely, February 9th, 1964, the Beatles, who I hadn't heard of, except for 2 days before, they were going to be an Ed Sullivan show. We only had 3 networks at that time, NBC, ABC, and CBS. So there wasn't a lot of things to watch other than from those three networks. Anyway, so the Beatles came on February 9th, 1964, and it created, they were from Great Britain, it created excitement that you wouldn't believe. I also think that since that was only like 3 months after President Kennedy was assassinated, that it's hard to believe. You had to be there to realize how depressed our country was in the assassination of Kennedy, because he was someone people loved, depended on his word, and when he was assassinated, it brought the country to its knees. So for the next 4 days after he was assassinated, we all watched TV and saw the funeral and everything take place. And so it was a sad time for teenagers, for the whole world really, but the teenagers, you want to be happy at that time in your life, and it wasn't a happy thing. So when the Beatles came along, I think it was just the right thing at the right time, and it brought a lot of young people into a real excitement.
So the Beatles were also a part of the British invasion, along with the Rolling Stones, I believe, were also part of that.
They were the beginning. The Beatles were the beginning. Then all of the other bands came along. In fact, this seems kind of strange, but our perception of it, if it wasn't a British group or a singer or entertainers, they weren't good. It's weird because we all thought, that our country's bands and groups weren't as hip or whatever, as cool as these guys were. And so so anything that came from Great Britain was great. That's how everybody perceived it. Yeah.
There were other artists around that protested the war by using music. Was that music just as popular as like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and other groups around this area, or was that mostly just people in like the hippie group that listened to those artists more than others?
Well, Bob Dylan in particular falls in that category. He had a lot of he has a lot of anti-protest songs, and he had lyrics, stories. I mean, the guy didn't seem all that with it, but boy, he had lyrics that would go on and on about protesting the war, and he was very, very popular, which was unusual because a lot of American groups weren't, and of course he wasn't a group, but he was an entertainer that people followed very seriously, and people who, the hippies, you might call them the hippies, took every word he said and felt that he was representing the youth of the United States. But I think that most youth were just like youth are today. They just wanted to grow up, be happy, and enjoy themselves. I had two friends, a person ahead of me, and a person, he was a senior when I was a junior, and a sophomore when I was a junior. They both went to Vietnam, and the first 3 months they both got killed. So it was a scary thing. And one of the reasons why it was so an undesirable place to go was we didn't know really, or at least the youth didn't know what we were fighting for. We were told we were fighting against communism, but it was a difficult explanation for everybody to explain it to the youth. And even today, I think there's questions about why we were there. I know a lot of people have talked about there is oil in that area, and that we were after that too. So I'd like to think that we always have the best intentions as the United States, but you know, you have to wonder if there were other reasons besides communism.
Do you think the 60s would have turned out differently had JFK not been assassinated early?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure anybody can answer that. I'm sure that, wow, you know, you have to question whether things are already predestined to some extent. I mean, with things meant to happen ahead of time that happen, I don't know. A lot of people say definitely not, but I'm just not sure of that. So I'd like to think that it would have been a safer, more peaceful place, but I'm not sure that it would have been. It's all great. It's all wonderful, and because of the things that happened in the 60s, we are like we are today.
Thank you, Mr. Brown.
Yes! It was fun. I enjoyed it.